Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl. Today I'm sharing the American Literature course that I'm going to be doing. As many of you know, I have been doing a British literature course for quite a while now, and I basically used the Master Books curriculum for my British literature. At the time that I bought that, I also bought the American and the World course. I'll talk a little bit more about what I thought of the British one when I finish it, but at first I thought I might not use the American one. But as I started going through it, I decided that I did want to use a lot of the things that they have in this book and some of the recommendations for the books that they have. However, I put together my own list as well of books that are not in this course. So when you see the books I'm going to be reading, they are not all part of the Master Books American Literature. So basically, the poetry, most of the poetry I'm reading, and when I'm not showing a book, then it's usually from the course. But I went through lists of all of the great American novels and picked some that I wanted to read and ones that I wanted to reread. This is a lot of books, especially when you mix it with the ones that are in the course. And so chances are it's going to take me longer than a year. My goal would be to do this in 2025 so that in 2026 I can do the world one. However, by the time I'm finished with the British one at the end of December, it will have taken me a year and a half. So I am thinking this will probably take me a year and a half to 2 years. But I do have the goal to do it in 1 year. So it will depend on how many of these I actually end up reading and how quickly I read them. With the British course, I had a list of a bunch of books I wanted to read, and some of them I chose not to reread just because as I was going along, I just wasn't in the mood anymore. And that may happen with some of these books as well. There's also the chance that I might be reading a book and not enjoying it and put it down. There are some, like I said, rereads that I might decide I'm not in the mood for, and since I've already reread them, they won't be a priority. So I'm going to go through the list of everything I'm going to be reading with my American Literature course. First, it goes from The New Land to 1750, and this is Puritanism and Native American Voices. So I'll be reading The History of Plymouth Plantation, poetry from Edward Taylor, or I don't know if it's poetry, but something from Edward Taylor, the Navajo creation legend, and the first constitution of the Native Americans. And then Jonathan Edwards, Anne Bradstreet's poetry, and Cotton Mather. Then it goes into the Revolutionary period from 1750 to 1800. And I will be reading Benjamin Franklin's letter to his son, excerpts from Poor Richard's Almanac, Phillis Wheatley, the Patrick Henry speech, Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, the Declaration of Independence. These are all things that I have read before in homeschool, but I will probably read them again. The Letter to Her Daughter from Abigail Adams. Then it goes into the 1800 to 1840 national period, A Growing Nation. And I'll be reading William Cullen Bryant, The Devil and Tom Walker by Washington Irving. And I believe I have read that before, but I don't remember for sure. And then I will probably reread The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and The Raven by Poe. Maybe The Fall of Usher. I don't know if I feel like reading that one again. And The Telltale Heart is also on their list. Again, a reread I'm not sure if I'm going to do. I'm not the biggest fan of Edgar Allan Poe. The first full-length novel would be The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. And this is a reread, but I haven't read this for probably at least 25 years. So I really do want to reread this. Then we get to the 1840 to 1855, Romanticism and New England Renaissance. I'll be reading The Birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And then another reread I really do want to do is The House of Seven Gables. It's been about 16 years since I read this one. So I am hoping to reread that. I'll be rereading The Paul Revere's Ride by Longfellow and Evangeline, also by him. And then poetry by Oliver Wendell Holmes, James Russell Lowell, and John Greenleaf Whittier, Emily Dickinson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, poems that are about Thoreau. They did have To Read Walden by him, but I just read that this year, so I won't be rereading that. And then there is some poetry by Herman Melville. I have always kind of wanted to read Moby Dick, but after this last year, I've heard of a few people that have read Moby Dick, and the way they talk about it, I don't think I actually want to read the whole book. And Chantel shared this graphic novel, and it's so small, and I think I'm going to read this graphic novel and call it good. Then it goes to 1855 to 1865, Division, War, and Reconciliation, and there will be Whitman poetry, African American spirituals, the Gettysburg Address, Chief Joseph, Frederick Douglass, other Civil War poetry and songs, and then I'll probably reread Little Women. Again, this would have to be, when I get to it, deciding if I want to take the time to do that because I have read Little Women multiple times. Then it goes to 1865 to 1915, Realism, Naturalism, and the Frontier. And here I'm going to be reading a lot of Mark Twain. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn are on the list, and I have read both of those. And so I'm going to be reading the Manga Classics editions because then they will be very quick reads of it. And my daughter read these and really enjoyed them. So I know that they're well done. But one I'm going to be reading for the first time is A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. I've wanted to read this one for a long time. I found it at a used bookstore, this beautiful copy. And so I'm going to read that for the first time. And then I'm also going to be reading The Prince and the Pauper. And then there's some poetry from Jack London. And I am going to reread The Call of the Wild and or White Fang. I don't know if I will read both. And I don't know which one I want to read the most, but it's been since I was in high school when I read these the last time. And so I think I want to read White Fang, but I'm not sure. So I'll see what I feel like when I get there. And then there are some more short stories from people I've never heard of. Brett Hort, Kate Chopin, Edward Arlington Robinson, Edgar Lee Masters poetry. And then we enter 1915 to 1946, the modern age. And I will finally be reading The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. That has been on my list for a long time. Some Robert Frost poetry, T.S. Eliot and Langston Hughes, E.E. Cummings. And then I'm going to read The Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. I knew I wanted to read at least one Hemingway. I don't believe I've ever read a book by him before. And this was the one that I think I will enjoy the most. And then I've talked on here before about how I wanted to reread The Great Gatsby. I read it in high school and I did not like it. And so I've wanted to try it again as an adult. So I have a copy of that. And then I'm also going to read The Curious Case of Benjamin Button by F. Scott Fitzgerald as well. This book has a bunch of short stories by him. I don't know if I'll end up reading all of them or if I'll just read Benjamin Button, but I do want to get to both of those from him. Then they had some things by Faulkner, but I've read one Faulkner and it was enough to last me for the rest of my life. I don't ever want to read him again. So I'm moving straight on to Steinbeck and I'm going to read The Red Pony. I've never read this one before. And then I really want to reread East of Eden. When I read this, it was about probably like 13 years ago and I absolutely loved it. So I've wanted to reread that for a long time. And then I want to read We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. And if I'm in the mood, I may reread The Haunting of Hill House, also by her. It's been a long time since I've read that as well. And I don't really remember much about it, except that I think it was on Goodreads that I wrote that it was really interesting and I liked it. So I will probably try to reread that. And then I'm going to read the short story, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. And then I'm going to go Westerns. And I have read Louis L'Amour before as a kid. My dad has this huge collection of Louis L'Amour, and as a kid I would read some of his. And I don't remember if I've read Hondo or not, but that is the one I chose to read. And then another book I read about 20 years ago is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I'm going to reread this. This is by Betty Smith. And then it goes to the modern age, 1946 to 1960. It has Tennessee Williams. And then I'm going to be reading The Crucible by Arthur Miller. And also by him, The Death of a Salesman. One book that I have thought for a long time that I read, but when I read the synopsis of it, I realized I don't think I've ever read this. So I don't know why I thought I had, but The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. I'm going to read that. And then one that I also have been interested in reading for a long time is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Then it gets to the last section, which is Contemporary Writers 1960 to the Present. And I'm going to be reading Everything That Rises, Must Converge by Flannery O'Connor, A Worn Path by Endora Weddy, The Jilting of Granny Weatherall by Catherine Ann Porter. And then I will probably reread The Outsiders. It hasn't been that long since I read this book, but I did enjoy it and it's not very long, so I may or may not reread that one. I'll be reading Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And then another reread is To Kill a Mockingbird. It's been a very long time since I've read this. So that one is a reread I do really want to do. And then there's two more books. One that I've never read before, The Chosen by Chaim Potok. I don't know if that's how you say his name. And then I really would like to reread this book. I've talked about it on here a few times. It's been probably 25 years since I read it. And this is The Stand by Stephen King. I picked up this used copy because I didn't own it. And because I fully intended on rereading it this year and I'd forgotten how big it was. This is a ginormous book. So really, by the time I get to the end of this course, it will depend on whether I am in the mood for this book or not, whether I read it, or whether it just goes back on the shelf and eventually I reread it. But that is all of the books for my American Literature course. Let me know if there's any that you think I'm missing, unless it's Faulkner. I don't want to read him. And let me know if you've read any of these, if any of these are your favorites.